The cold air hung heavy over the private terminal, carrying the distant hum of idling jet engines. A dense morning mist rolled over the tarmac, swallowing the faint echoes of ground crew chatter. Everything about this place exuded exclusivity, quiet efficiency, polished metal, and an unspoken hierarchy where money ruled and everyone else fell in line. Captain Jack Harding stood near the foot of the aircraft stairs, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the sleek black sedan approaching in the distance. His expression, hard as steel, barely shifted as the car rolled to a stop. A uniformed driver stepped out, moving with precision, and opened the rear door. And then she emerged. Sloane Monroe, tall, poised, radiating the effortless confidence of someone used to commanding rooms without raising her voice. A tailored navy coat draped over her shoulders, the morning light catching the subtle shimmer of expensive fabric. Her steps were unhurried, heels clicking against the concrete as she approached. Behind her, her assistant, Avery, a petite woman with a sharp gaze, moved quickly to adjust the leather bag hanging off her shoulder. She cast a wary glance toward the captain, sensing the energy before a word was even spoken. Harding didn't move, didn't offer a greeting. He simply stood there, staring past Sloane as if she didn't exist. Sloane noticed. She noticed everything. The stiffening of his posture, the way his lips barely parted in mild distaste, the dismissiveness in his eyes. Years in high-stakes business meetings had taught her to read the smallest tells, and Harding, he had already given himself away. "Good morning, Captain," she said evenly, offering the same professional courtesy she extended to anyone she encountered. Silence. Harding shifted, barely inclining his head, eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder, as if he was looking for someone more important. Avery hesitated, glancing between them, gripping the handle of Sloane's suitcase a little tighter. "We're ready to board," she interjected politely, trying to cut through the tension. Harding finally acknowledged her. Just a flicker of a glance, but there was something condescending about it. "The flight is prepped," he said, voice clipped, his tone making it clear that was all the conversation they were going to get. Then, without another word, he turned and strode up the aircraft stairs, his polished shoes tapping against the metal. Avery opened her mouth to speak, but Sloane lifted a hand slightly, a silent signal. Not yet. She had encountered men like Harding before, men who mistook quiet power for weakness, who believed their position made them untouchable. Patience, she reminded herself. This wasn't the moment to correct him. That would come later. She climbed the steps gracefully, entering the jet's pristine cabin. The smell of polished leather and fresh linen greeted her as she took her seat by the window. The flight attendants, unlike their captain, were warm and accommodating, moving with quiet efficiency. But there was an underlying tension in the air. They had seen the exchange. The cabin door sealed shut. Engines hummed to life, sending a gentle vibration through the floor. Across from her, Avery settled in, eyes still sharp with unspoken frustration. She leaned in, lowering her voice. That was deliberate. Sloane lifted her glass of water, taking a slow sip before responding. "I know." Avery frowned. "You're just going to let that slide?" Sloane smiled faintly, setting the glass down with deliberate care. People like him always go too far, and when they do, they never see the fall coming. Avery exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I don't get how you stay so calm." Sloane turned to the window, watching as the jet taxied down the runway, the morning mist parting like a curtain. Because men like Jack Harding always think they're in control, until the moment they aren't. The jet climbed steadily, cutting through the dense morning clouds as the world below shrank into a distant patchwork of grays and blues. Inside the cabin, the quiet luxury contrasted sharply with the storm brewing beneath its polished surface. Sloane remained composed, her gaze fixed out the window, her thoughts as sharp as the city skyline fading behind them. Avery, however, was anything but calm. She tapped her fingers against the armrest, exhaling sharply before leaning closer. "You know he's going to push it, right?" she murmured. "Guys like that always do." Sloane barely shifted, her lips curling into a subtle, knowing smile. "Yes, and that's exactly what I'm waiting for." Avery sighed, shaking her head. "I swear your patience could outlast a century." In the cockpit, Harding sat rigidly, his knuckles whitening around the controls. The irritation simmering beneath his practiced professionalism refused to dissipate. The woman behind him, silent, unbothered, unnerved him more than he cared to admit. She hadn't protested, hadn't called him out, hadn't demanded anything. And yet he felt her presence looming over him, A quiet reminder of something he couldn't quite name. "Something on your mind, Captain?" The voice of his co-pilot, Ryan West, barely cut through his thoughts. Harding exhaled, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off an invisible weight. "Nothing that concerns you." Ryan hesitated before turning back to his instruments, though his fingers lingered over the radio switch. He had flown with Harding for years, long enough to recognize when the man's ego was steering more than the aircraft. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere remained deceptively serene. The faint clinking of glassware, the occasional murmur of flight attendants moving about. But beneath it, tension coiled like a wire pulled too tight. A soft chime from Sloane's phone drew her attention. She glanced at the screen, just a single notification. A brief message from an unknown number. "Everything is in place, just let it happen." She locked the screen, exhaling softly. Avery frowned. "Something I should know about?" Sloane met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "Not yet." Unaware of the silent chess game unfolding, Harding clenched his jaw, staring at the controls but seeing nothing. His mind churned with unspoken grievances, his frustration feeding on itself. He didn't realize how quickly the inevitable was approaching. Harding's grip on the control yoke tightened as the jet cruised at altitude, cutting effortlessly through the sky. The silence in the cockpit felt heavier than usual, his own thoughts drowning out the steady hum of the instruments. He knew he should be focusing on the flight, but his mind remained locked on the woman seated behind him. Sloane Monroe. He didn't know much about her, and that irritated him. People like her, calm, composed, exuding that quiet confidence, were the worst kind. They never needed to prove themselves, and that made them dangerous. Ryan glanced at Harding from the co-pilot's seat, noticing the tension in his captain's posture. "Everything good up here?" Harding didn't look away from the controls. "Just fly the damn plane." Ryan bit his tongue, returning his focus to the instruments. He had a bad feeling about this flight, though he couldn't quite pinpoint why. Back in the cabin, Sloane placed her phone down on the table, the message still lingering in her mind. She didn't need to reply. Everything was already in motion. Avery, watching her closely, crossed her arms. "I don't like how quiet he is," she muttered. Sloane glanced at her assistant. "It's not the quiet ones you should worry about," she said softly. "It's the ones who don't know when to stop." Avery exhaled sharply. "And what happens when he doesn't?" Sloane's lips barely moved as she answered. "Then he makes a mistake." As if on cue, the intercom crackled to life, and Harding's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We will be maintaining our cruising altitude for the duration of the flight. Please remain seated as we expect some turbulence ahead." Avery scoffed. "There's no turbulence on the radar." Sloane simply smiled. "Of course not." Harding knew exactly what he was doing. It wasn't about turbulence. It was about control. A subtle way of reminding everyone, especially her, that he was the one in charge. But what he didn't realize was that control was already slipping from his grasp. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, but the tension was growing, thickening like an approaching storm. Sloane remained still, fingers lightly tracing the rim of her glass as if she had all the time in the world. Across from her, Avery shifted uncomfortably, casting a wary glance toward the cockpit door. "I don't like this," she murmured. "Something's off." Sloane didn't respond immediately. She simply lifted her glass, took a slow sip, and set it down with deliberate care. "Patience," she said finally. "He's unraveling." Avery's brow furrowed. "What if he does something reckless?" Sloane's gaze remained calm, unreadable. "Then he does." In the cockpit, Harding could feel his irritation festering. He had expected some reaction by now, a complaint, a demand to speak with him, anything. But there was nothing. No confrontation, no resistance, just quiet. And that quiet was eating at him. His fingers hovered over the intercom switch again, maybe another announcement, maybe a reminder of who was in charge. But before he could press it, Ryan cleared his throat. "Sir, we have a message coming in from the owner's office." Harding froze. His eyes flicked to the small communication screen. A priority notification was waiting, marked for immediate review. His pulse quickened as he hesitated for just a second too long. Ryan glanced at him. "Do you want me to?" "I'll handle it." Harding's voice was clipped, his hand already moving to open the message. The text appeared in sharp, unyielding letters. "Upon landing, you will be required to report immediately for an operational review. Await further instructions." Harding's stomach dropped. Back in the cabin, Sloane reached for her phone as a new message arrived. She didn't need to open it to know what it said. Avery leaned in. "Is it time?" Sloane exhaled, her expression as composed as ever. "Not yet," Avery frowned. "What are we waiting for?" Sloane's lips curled into the faintest smile. "For him to go too far." And she knew. He would. He always would. Harding's breath was steady, but his pulse betrayed him. He read the message again, his mind racing for an explanation. An operational review? That wasn't routine. Someone had filed a complaint. Someone had made a call. His jaw clenched as he glanced at the small camera feed showing the cabin. Sloane Monroe sat there, perfectly still, perfectly composed. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't even pretending to be. She just waited. Ryan stole a glance at him. "Captain, should I acknowledge receipt of the message?" Harding forced himself to inhale slowly. No response necessary. Ryan hesitated. "Sir, it's a direct instruction from—" "I said no response." The younger pilot pressed his lips together, nodding stiffly before turning back to his instruments. Harding leaned back in his seat, his fingers drumming against his thigh. He refused to believe that this was anything more than an overreaction. Maybe someone on the ground had misread something. Maybe it was protocol. It had to be. And yet, the unease sat heavy in his chest. In the cabin, Sloane crossed her legs, adjusting the silk fabric of her trousers. She had seen it before. Men who mistook silence for surrender. She could almost feel the weight of his frustration pressing through the walls of the cockpit. It was only a matter of time. Avery fidgeted, glancing toward the flight attendants who were exchanging uneasy looks. Even they could feel it. "I don't understand," she whispered. "If they already sent the message, why wait? Why not deal with him the second we land?" Sloane turned her gaze toward her assistant, the hint of a knowing smile on her lips. "Because men like him don't stop until they've destroyed themselves completely." Avery exhaled sharply. "And you think he's going to?" Sloane lifted her glass, taking a measured sip. "Watch." At that exact moment, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harding's voice came through, laced with forced politeness. "Due to flight conditions, we'll be maintaining cabin restrictions for the remainder of the journey. Your cooperation is expected." Avery sat up straighter. "Did he just—" Sloane didn't react. "Yes. He's trying to make it look like we're being difficult passengers." Sloane set her glass down, the faintest clink breaking the silence. "And that," she said softly, "was his first real mistake. Because now, everyone had heard it, everyone had seen it. Harding had just given them exactly what they needed." The cabin remained silent, save for the steady hum of the engines. Sloane's fingers drummed lightly against the polished table, her expression unreadable. Across from her, Avery sat rigid, hands curled into fists against her lap. "He's baiting us," Avery muttered, her voice low. Sloane didn't look at her. "I know." A flight attendant hesitated near the aisle, her posture stiff as she glanced between them and the cockpit door. She had heard the announcement too, and the tension in her stance betrayed her discomfort. Sloane offered her a small, reassuring nod. It was enough to make the woman exhale slightly before she turned away. Avery, however, was not reassured. "This isn't just unprofessional. He's trying to make us react." Sloane finally met her gaze. "Yes." Avery let out a frustrated breath. "And we're just going to sit here and let him?" Sloane's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. "No." Up in the cockpit, Harding kept his grip firm on the yoke, his knuckles white. The satisfaction from his announcement was already wearing thin, replaced by something colder, something closer to doubt. Ryan adjusted his headset, his brows drawn together. "Captain, what exactly was that about?" Harding didn't turn his head. "Cabin management." Ryan hesitated. "There were no actual flight conditions requiring—" "Are you questioning my authority?" Harding snapped, his voice sharper than intended. Ryan stiffened, his hand still over the controls. "No, sir, just making sure we're clear on the protocol." Harding exhaled through his nose, jaw tightening. "I'll handle the protocol." Ryan's grip on his controls tightened slightly, but he said nothing. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, Sloane's phone buzzed once. A short, simple message. "Final review in motion. Be ready." She turned the screen over, her expression never shifting. Avery eyed her carefully. "That from who I think it is?" Sloane took a slow breath. "Yes." Avery swallowed. "So this is happening?" Sloane's gaze flickered toward the cockpit door. "It already is." Avery let out a slow exhale. "What now?" Exhale. Sloane leaned back slightly, adjusting her cuffs. "Now we wait, because Harding wasn't done yet, and the next move would be his last." Harding's fingers tapped against the console, his frustration mounting with every second of silence from the cabin. He had expected pushback, maybe even a complaint relayed through the crew, but nothing came. The quiet felt suffocating. It was as if she was waiting for something, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Captain, we're about 30 minutes from descent. Should I notify the ground crew?" Harding barely acknowledged him. His gaze remained fixed on the monitor displaying the cabin feed. Sloane Monroe sat perfectly composed, hands folded over her lap, staring out the window as if she were above all of this. The way she carried herself, it unsettled him. Ryan sighed, adjusting his headset. "I'll handle it." Meanwhile, in the cabin, Avery's eyes flicked toward Sloane. "He's watching us." Sloane didn't move. "I know." Avery exhaled sharply. "How do you stay this calm?" Sloane finally turned her head, meeting Avery's gaze with quiet certainty. "Because I already know how this ends." A moment passed before Avery shook her head. "I don't get it. If the review is already in motion, why hasn't he been contacted directly? Why let this play out?" Sloane leaned back slightly. "Because people like Harding don't accept reality unless it hits them in the face." Avery frowned. "And when do you think that'll happen?" Sloane's phone buzzed once on the table. She didn't have to look at it to know the answer. "Soon." In the cockpit, another message flashed across the screen. Harding stiffened, his pulse quickening. "Formal review initiated. Await direct communication upon landing." His stomach twisted. That was not a standard protocol message. That was a warning. Ryan noticed the change in his posture. "Sir?" Harding forced himself to breathe evenly. "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was the beginning of the end. And somehow Sloane Monroe knew it. The descent had begun. The engines hummed steadily as the jet sliced through layers of cloud, dipping toward the city lights that stretched endlessly below. Inside the cockpit, Harding's pulse pounded against his skull. He had never felt this way before, cornered, powerless. His hands tightened over the controls as he swallowed hard, trying to ignore the impending dread creeping up his spine. Ryan sat tensely beside him, silently monitoring the descent. He had flown with Harding long enough to recognize the shift. His captain was no longer in control, not of the aircraft, not of the situation, and certainly not of himself. A notification flashed on the screen. This time, there was no ambiguity. "Captain Harding, upon landing you will be relieved of duty. Prepare for immediate debriefing." For a second, Harding forgot to breathe. His grip on the yoke faltered, the aircraft dipping slightly before he corrected it. His mouth was dry, his mind screaming for a way out, a way to regain his footing before everything collapsed. But there was no way out. Sloane Monroe had made sure of that. In the cabin, Avery noticed the subtle shift in the plane's motion, her fingers gripping the armrest. "Did you feel that?" she whispered. Sloane remained motionless, watching the clouds break apart, revealing the city beneath them. "Yes." Avery licked her lips, nervous. "You think he knows?" Sloane finally turned to her, her expression impossibly calm. He knew the moment he stepped onto this plane. He just convinced himself he could still win. Avery exhaled, trying to process it. "And now?" Sloane tilted her head slightly, listening. The cockpit was silent over the intercom, no announcements, no final words from the captain. Just the weight of inevitable defeat pressing down on him like a storm cloud. She glanced toward the front of the aircraft. Now he realizes he already lost. The wheels touched down, the tires gripping the runway, as the jet glided smoothly toward its designated stop. The moment the engines began their cool-down cycle, the cabin door unlocked with a faint mechanical hiss. Then came the headlights. A convoy of black SUVs rolled onto the tarmac, their engines barely audible over the slowing hum of the jet's turbines. Doors opened in unison, and men in tailored suits stepped out, moving with quiet, absolute purpose. Avery's breath hitched. "Oh my God." Sloane stood, smoothing her coat as the aircraft door was unlatched from the outside. Inside the cockpit, Harding's hands trembled over the controls. He didn't need to see who was waiting for him, he already knew. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "Captain, I think they're here for you." Harding let out a slow, shaking breath. "I know." For the first time in his career, he didn't want to step out of the cockpit. The aircraft door opened, and the first man to step inside was not security. It was David Monroe. A towering figure of power and precision, his presence filled the jet like a thunderclap. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Sloane met his gaze as he approached, her expression unchanging. David stopped just before her, his sharp eyes flicking briefly toward the cockpit before returning to his wife. "Did he give you any trouble?" Avery barely breathed. Sloane, ever composed, offered the faintest smile. "No," she said, her voice effortlessly even. "He gave himself trouble." David studied her for a moment, then let out a quiet, knowing exhale. He turned toward the cockpit. "Captain Harding," he called, his tone as smooth as it was final. The silence stretched. A moment later, the cockpit door creaked open. Harding stepped out. His uniform was still crisp, his posture still straight, but the defeat in his eyes betrayed him. He was no longer the one in command. He was a man walking toward a sentence he had written for himself. David tilted his head slightly. "You have something you'd like to say?" Harding opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His throat was tight, the words refusing to form. David didn't wait for an answer. He stepped aside, motioning toward the open aircraft door. "Then let's not waste any more time." Harding's breath stuttered. His legs felt heavy as he moved forward, his shadow stretching across the pristine floor. He hesitated at the threshold, staring at the men waiting for him outside, and then, with nothing left to say, he stepped off the aircraft. The door closed behind him with a quiet, definitive click. Avery let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That's it?" she asked, almost disbelieving. Sloane sat back down, reaching for her glass of water. "That's it." Avery shook her head, still processing. "I don't know what I was expecting." Sloane lifted the glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip before setting it down again. "That's the thing about people like him," she murmured. "They never see it coming until it's already over." And with that, the engines powered down, the outside world moving on without him.